following stories are about people who encountered a time slip, a phenomenon that causes unexpected time travel. The Margolis family. In 1978, the Margolis family were walking through the town of Horning in Norfolk, in northeast England, when suddenly everything fell silent. Then they all felt dizzy and disorientated, and the landscape appeared to just melt away, and the modern building that had just recently walked past has suddenly turned into ancient cottages, and the modern road in front of them turned into a muddy track. 1 minute they were looking at cars driving along the road, then they were confronted with horses and carts. Then a thin man wearing old-fashioned brown clothing was coming towards them, but walked straight past as if they were invisible. But as quickly as the ancient town suddenly appeared from out of nowhere, the modern world returned with cars and traffic and modern buildings. Andy Leask. In 1977, a man called Andy Leask was 5 years old and his older sister was 7, and they were staying with their great aunt in an old Norfolk house that dated back to the 1600s. Their story began when they woke up very early and went to the living room, where they saw a fire burning and an old woman in a long dress and cap using a spinning wheel. She looked up but didn't say anything. Thinking she would make their breakfast, the children walked into the kitchen, but it was dark. When they went back to the living room to ask the old woman a question, they found she had completely vanished. The fireplace was cold, and there was no longer a fire burning. Later that morning, when some adults appeared, they asked about the old woman, but they said that it was impossible as home help had not arrived that day. To this day, Andy was still baffled by the incident, and where the past and present had somehow collided. Andrew Leask now believed he and his sister were caught up in a time slip. The Roman cavalry. Colin Ayling and Colin England were experienced metal detector users, and at the time of the strange incident had been detected in an area called Boulder Field in Shrewsbury, Western England. It was called Boulder Fields because of the large number of boulders that were piled up on one particular location. One day they got lucky when they found a Republican silver denarius, which was the standard Roman silver coin that dated back to the time of Julius Caesar, along with several other Roman bronzes and other denarius coins from the time of Rutilius Flaccus, circa 70 BC. They also found other Roman artefacts and the tip of a Roman javelin, where the name Nigel had been stamped. The original Roman name was Nigellus, but it had obviously been shortened to fit the javelin. As the men were busy studying the amazing finds, they suddenly heard the sound of horses' hooves galloping, and they appeared to be heading in their direction. They quickly took cover behind some boulders and could hear the sound as they thundered past where they'd just been standing. When they quickly looked up, expecting to see the horses galloping in the distance, there was nothing to be seen. The men felt totally disoriented by what had just happened and decided to head back to their car. They'd not travelled too far when they came upon a tightly packed hedge that appeared impenetrable, which was not there when they started the journey. After much effort in overcoming the obstacle, they managed to reach the car and took their findings to archaeologist Mike Stokes. It appears that the men had encountered a time slip, as the galloping horses could have been a detachment of Roman soldiers, and the sudden appearance of the hedge may have been part of a cavalry's detachment fortifications from 2,000 years ago. Anne May. Mrs. Anne May was a school teacher from Norwich in northwest England, and at the time the incident was in Inverness in the Scottish Highlands with her husband. They were studying the Bronze Age claver cans on the eastern side of the River Nairn. When they'd finished studying the cans, Anne May decided to take a rest against one of the stones, and suddenly a strange feeling came over her, and when she looked up, she saw a group of men that appeared to be dressed from the past. They had long dark hair and wore rough tunics with cross-gartered trousers that crossed at the ankle to the knee. Mrs. May could only look on in amazement as they dragged one of the big standing stones into an allocated place in the circle. But when a group of tourists suddenly walked into the site, the group of men suddenly vanished and she was returned to the present. Joan Forman. Author Joan Forman was visiting Haddon Hall, Derbyshire in the East Midlands of England and came upon a stone courtyard where 4 children were playing. The oldest of the children was a girl who looked to be about 10 years old, with shoulder-length fair hair. She was wearing a grey-green silk dress with a lace collar and a Dutch-style hat. When Joan first arrived at the scene, the girl had her back to her, but then she suddenly turned around to face her, and she could see a distinctive face. The girl had a wide jaw with a small upturned nose. As Joan moved closer to the girls, they suddenly vanished. It appears that the act of moving towards the girls had cut some sort of current between them, which had allowed Joan to be able to see them in her time. Joan then walked into the hall to look at the various paintings on the walls to see if she could identify the girl in any of the paintings. As she walked along, she finally came upon a portrait of a young girl titled Lady Grace Manners, wearing the same dress with lace collar and the distinctive Dutch hat. When Joan made inquiries, she found that Lady Grace Manners had been associated with Haddon Hall many centuries ago. Lady Grace Manners' father was the Duke of Rutland. Had Joan Forman come upon a sudden time slip? Edna Thomas. Sometime in the late 1950s, Edna Thomas of Shoeburyness in southeast Essex in southeast England was walking in the nearby countryside close to home. As she was returning from a walk, she distinctly sensed the breathing of a horse close by and could hear the sound of horses' hooves on the gravel. The horse was panting heavily, as if it was carrying a heavy load, but as she looked around to find where they were, she found there was absolutely nothing there, and was totally baffled as it was a wide open space, so there was nowhere they could have gone. Edna decided to make some inquiries and learned that the area she'd been walking had once been a brick field, and horses were used to pull the brick-laden carts along railway tracks. The area she'd been walking was the same location where she felt the horse's presence. Had Edna experienced a time slip or a residual haunting? Or stone tape theory, where environmental elements are capable of storing traces of human thoughts, emotions, and in the case of Edna Thomas, the regular actions of a working horse? Louise Hand. In 1920, Louise Hand was 9 years old and was playing in front of her grandmother's cottage in Bury, Lancashire, northwest England. Louise then ran inside her grandmother's cottage to get some refreshment and found that the furniture had changed and the cottage was older looking. The door to the kitchen was no longer there, and the insides were extremely quiet and dark. Louise immediately thought she'd run into the wrong cottage. She then quickly ran out to check if she was in the right place, and found that she was, and then ran back inside, only to be confronted with the same surroundings. Totally confused, she ran outside and continued to play with the other children. It was not until she spent some considerable time playing outside with the other children that she dared to re-enter her grandmother's cottage. She approached the cottage with trepidation, and upon entering, found that things were back to normal. Louise Hand never forgot the strange incident, and over the years, she came to the conclusion that she had somehow experienced some sort of time slip. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. There are many people who claim to have experienced strange time experiences or dislocations, and the following story appears to be that of a classic time slip that was experienced by 2 reputable witnesses in the late 1960s. On January the 4th, 1969, Dr. White and his wife were driving across the Isle of Wight in the UK, towards the village of Neaton, which sits at the south end of the island. The couple were on their way to dine with friends at Neaton and decided to take the more leisurely road across the downs of the island. Although there was a full moon, it was not a clear night, as there were also dark, heavy clouds in the sky. They began to ascend the first hill towards the downs and observed chalk pits to their left and open fields to their right. As they looked around, they realised that they were in an extremely remote part of the island and were miles away from any buildings, and the nearest farmhouse would have been many miles away. all of a sudden they came upon what appeared to be bobbing lights, which looked like a lot of people moving about. The only explanation they could offer was that the lights could only be attributed to shepherds working in the fields with their sheep, as it was the time of year for lambing. The only other reason for the massive lights was that there was an agricultural exhibition. However, holding such an event in early January did seem rather odd. As they reached the top of a hill, they had a better view of the lights, which appeared to cover the field to their right, which to them looked like a great city. It was at this point that Dr. White had stopped driving, and both he and his wife gazed in amazement at the myriad of twinkling lights, and were still unsure of what they were looking at. At this stage, the thought that the massive lights could have anything to do with the paranormal had not entered their mind, and that there would have been a rational explanation for what they were seeing. What started out as a simple journey to visit friends was now turning into a baffling mystery. Suddenly, they came upon what they believed was a simple cart track to an outlying farm, but all at once came upon what looked to be a well-lit city street with assorted buildings on either side, lit up in colours of red, green and orange. The couple were now feeling totally disoriented, and their reality was further challenged when they reached the farm track, only to discover that it was deserted with no buildings whatsoever and covered in shadows and moonlight. The buildings had somehow vanished. Now in a state of shock, Dr. White and his wife had started what they believed was a simple journey under cloudy skies and the full moon, but were now feeling unsure and uncertain about everything, where Mrs. White was hoping to come upon a familiar landmark in order to get back to some sort of normality. They eventually came upon an inn bathed in light called the Hare and Hounds. The inn was a friendly dwelling at the crossroads at the centre of the island to Newport on one hand and Murstone on the other. But their feelings of safety and security were short-lived, because as they turned the corner towards a lighted inn, in front of their car were figures running backwards and forwards across the road carrying torches. As they looked out of the side windows, they could see the fields were covered in lights as far as the eye could see. Amongst the flurry of lights was an extremely tall man with clear-cut features, and he seemed to stand out from the crowd. The tall man was wearing what looked like a sleeveless outer garment that appeared to be made of leather and a broad belt. The doctor felt that he could not just sit in the car amid the chaos, and in order to ease their tension and nervous curiosity, went in search of answers and decided he would get out of the car and ask someone what the reason was for all the frenzied activity. Again, it had not dawned on the couple that what they were seeing could have been illusory. However, as the car was about 20 yards away from the Hare and Hounds Inn, all of the lights and figures suddenly vanished, as if someone had suddenly turned off a light switch, and the inn was now in darkness other than the usual lights shining through the windows. The doctor and his wife were so shaken by what they just observed that instead of just getting out of the car to look for answers, they immediately drove to their destination in Neaton without stopping. After their evening out, they bravely decided to return along the same route in the early hours of the morning. But the landscape had returned to normal, and the oppressive heavy feeling that they'd had on the way to their friend's house had lifted, and the sense of unreality had gone. As they looked to the sky, the clouds had vanished and a full moon shone brightly. Questions were later asked as to what the couple had experienced, where Mrs. White believed that they saw events from a different time but in the same location. Had they witnessed a Roman legion, as it believed that the Romans had once camped in that area, and torches were certainly used for lighting purposes throughout the empire. That location was also occupied by Vikings, who set up their winter camps in the late 10th century and used the island as a base before attacking mainland Britain. The tall man appeared to be dressed in clothing that would have fitted a Viking profile rather than a Roman costume, and the Norsemen were a tall race of people. The lights that the couple observed seemed to relate to the past, as the lights seemed to be handheld rather than fixed street lighting. Another theory could have been that instead of being caught up in a timeslip from the past, maybe what they saw was a vision of the future, and was it some sort of apocalyptic post-nuclear world where people were again reduced to carrying handheld torches along with primitive clothing. Fortunately, Dr. White and his wife never experienced such an ordeal again, but there is no doubt that their sensuality would have been seriously challenged. What started out as a simple car journey for Pamela Robinson after visiting her sister turned into a nightmare, as if she'd entered into another dimension or counted a time slip. In May of 2006, Pamela spent time with her sister in Charlotte, North Carolina. The sister had just moved to North Carolina and Pamela had driven there from her home in Georgia. She then left her sister's home in Charlotte to head back to Georgia at 7:30 a.m. on May the 22nd, 2006. She followed her sister to the expressway because she was on her way to work at uptown Charlotte. Pamela then continued on towards Expressway 177 in Charlotte, towards 185 South. She remembers driving and seeing landmarks that she'd taken notice of while travelling to North Carolina. Pamela said that she did not remember anything else until she came upon a fork in the road and saw a sign that read 126. She was confused because she'd just driven 2 hours and was completely unaware that she'd travelled in another direction. Pamela had no memory of travelling for 2 hours and she couldn't see where the highway led to on the right. She then pulled over to the side of the road and called her sister and was in a panic because she couldn't understand what had happened and was feeling disorientated. They spoke for a few minutes and the sister told her to see if she can get off and head back the way she came. However, this was where things started to get even weirder. About a mile down the expressway, she got off at the first exit on the right. Off to the right was a gas station. She noticed that the area looked fairly isolated and the road was gravelly in a bad condition. The buildings were old red brick buildings, the windows were broken and some had cardboard covering them. There was no traffic on the roads and no sidewalks. However, when she pulled up to the gas station, she saw there were about 6 cars there. She decided to go into the gas station building to see if someone could tell her where she was and how she could find 185. When she went inside the gas station, she noticed a few people there. The cashier was a tall, heavy-set white man with a full beard and was wearing a blue jean overall. She then went up to the cashier to ask him questions, but he totally ignored her and continued to talk to the other customers. She then tried to speak to some of the customers, but they too ignored her. Pamela became scared because she thought that they ignored her because she was black. Pamela was now feeling bewildered and lost and decided to go back to her car. On the way back to her car, she noticed 2 young white guys, possibly in their early 20s. They had white pants and white t-shirts, and they were walking towards a white van. The young man on her immediate right was walking with his head down, and the other guy on his right looked to be play-kicking and trying to joke about with him. Pamela walked up to the guy on her right to ask him for directions. He appeared confused and looked at her in a strange way and would occasionally look up at her, but mostly kept his head down. But he at least could see her, unlike the other people in the gas station. But the other guy didn't seem to notice her at all. He didn't even acknowledge her or that his friend was talking to her. She continued to walk beside the guy, asking him questions, and he said that he worked in Augusta, Georgia, and he had no idea about 185. What was even stranger was that the guy had a look on his face like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was then that she came to the realization that his friend and the people in the gas station didn't talk to her because they could not see her. So how come that one guy was the only person that could see her and actually speak to her? Maybe he thought she was a ghost or something. Pamela got back on 126 for another mile until she saw a turnaround and then headed back the way she came. She then started seeing signs that she was on 177 and signs for Columbia, South Carolina. Eventually she saw a policeman and wondered whether she should get his attention, but decided against it for fear that he wouldn't see her. She stayed behind him until she reached the turn for Charlotte. During her ride back to Charlotte, nothing was familiar to her and doesn't remember having seen any of the signs, exits or landmarks. Pamela finally made it back to Charlotte relieved, but had no idea what had happened to her, and after checking the clock, found that almost 5 hours of her life was missing. She made it back to Georgia at 3:30 p.m, which should have been a 4-hour journey. Pamela does not know whether it was related, but when she got home, her face, arms, legs and chest had so many bruises that she had to go to the emergency room for treatment. Pamela continued to ask herself what exactly happened and where she'd been and why had everything looked like it was from the 50s or 60s. The weather in Charlotte was sunny and bright, but when she was out of the gas station, it was gloomy and overcast and very quiet. The gas station appeared completely deserted, except for the people. The gas station stood by itself, as there were no other buildings around it. The closest building were down on the right from the gas station, and those were unoccupied and old with broken windows. There were no streetlights, no traffic, no grass, and hardly any trees, and everything looked dead. Had she stepped into another world, another dimension, or another time? And how did she get the bruises?